Hello and welcome to an updated guide for Ashe. In the past, I made a few videos covering general tips and settings. However, with the release of Overwatch 2, a lot of new players have been interested in trying her out. Before we get started, I'm a top 500 Ashe main and have over 5,000 hours on the hero across both console and PC. So this isn't exactly my first rodeo. Ashe is a hit scan DPS, generally mid to long range, and excels at outputting high damage. If that's your style, let's get into why you should play her. In Overwatch 1, Ashe was easily the most consistent DPS. Never the best, but a reliable hero in every situation. The game used to play a lot slower, meaning you had more opportunity to find kills and reload. When Overwatch 2 was 6v6, tanks could hold a stronger front line, allowing you to poke from a safer distance and pressure the enemy from high ground. Dynamites were especially dangerous back then because teams would play closer together, letting you build much faster ultimate charge than usual. Now, although that sounds great, it unfortunately isn't the case for Overwatch 2. 5v5 encourages faster paced gameplay, and many new heroes were designed around that philosophy. Ashe had no changes to compensate for her slower gameplay, and her fall-off damage was nerfed in Overwatch 1. She ultimately got a lot worse, but that doesn't mean you can't climb while playing her. Ashe is far more situational, depending primarily on map and the other team's supports. Furthermore, her range isn't exactly optimal against the newly introduced DPS Sojourn or Widowmaker, who had her health reverted to 200. With all this being said, let's get into my settings that might help you make up for these downsides. First of all, I have my sensitivity set to 5.2 with 800 DPI. I found this to be a comfort spot for every hit scan DPS that I play, and I typically avoid altering my sensitivities between heroes. This is because at any point during a match, you might have to swap or counterpick, and it can hurt your gameplay having to adjust so often. Ashe is not always ideal on every point of every map, so keep that in mind. Moving on, I have my scope sensitivity at 51.44. As mentioned in my previous guide, some of my friends who play snipers hover around this area of comfort to ensure a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that your sensitivity out of scope feels the same, allowing for seamless transitioning between targets regardless of range, which you will do a lot on Ashe. Another quick tip is turning off recoil, recovery, aim compensation. By default, it's enabled. Turning it off is better for muscle memory and having more control over your decision making, especially from high ground. This allows you to recenter your crosshair on your own rather than the game doing it for you. Let's talk about my crosshair. It's actually gone through a series of changes, but these two have been my bread and butter. First up is my typical crosshair that I used through the entirety of Overwatch 1. You can either set it to cyan or green, both vibrant colors on just about every map, especially with the night and day cycles and the new map rotations, and many of which are darker. I have the thickness at 1, crosshair length at 8, center gap of 5, opacity set to 100, outline opacity a comfortable 30, dot size 2, and dot opacity at 100. The main purpose of this crosshair is to line up shots on distant targets, including enemy snipers or your own dynamite. The benefit of this crosshair is it won't entirely cover the headshot hitbox, and it won't block any line of sight. Now, you may have noticed that it isn't actually the crosshair I'm currently using. Since launch, I've really enjoyed the small black circle. One of my favorite Ashe players in the Overwatch League, Hisu, was unstoppable, and upon further investigation, he uses the exact same settings. So the main purpose of this barely visible circle is to limit distractions and focus primarily on centering player outlines rather than fixating on your crosshair, a common mistake for newer or lower ranked players. As you continue to improve, this philosophy will end up improving your muscle memory. Set the color to black, thickness at 1, crosshair length 0, center gap 10, allowing for more visibility on targets, opacity set to 100, outline opacity of 0, dot size 2, and lastly, dot opacity at 0. The circle is very minimalistic, so it'll take a while to get used to, but it's worth trying. As for the controls, you're not going to really change anything outside of the punch. I prefer remapping my punch to the mouse button, making for easy headshot punch combos on flankers pressuring me. Ashe's crouch spam doesn't alter a hitbox very much, so often you'll decide to jump strafe. This is much easier to do when you aren't stretching your thumb for other keys like V, leaving it resting on the spacebar. I've heard of other players shifting their movement keys to ESDF, but that's personally not my cup of tea. Default controls on Ashe are ideal even among the top 500 players in Overwatch 2. Next up, let's talk video settings, since most new players don't know how detrimental these can be to your overall game performance and frame rate. Turn everything on low or off, seriously. Although Overwatch 2 might look horrible, the less detail and shadows and particles, the better. Overwatch 2 added needless map effects, and while you're playing Ashe, those can absolutely hinder your gameplay long term. On screen are my video settings. Feel free to pause the video, screenshot, and copy them. This might actually come as a surprise, but many people have encountered an unintentional bug involving controller settings in Overwatch 2. Apparently, your controller settings on PC, despite not using a controller, can actually bleed into your sensitivity and impact your gameplay. I would recommend turning off all controller sensitivity settings to avoid any reported problems, whether it's been fixed or not. Other top players have made extensive research on this topic, and they're a lot more qualified to explain it than myself. Kefri personally advocated for turning everything off, so I listened. Here are many bad habits that you may have picked up on Ashe during Overwatch 1, or perhaps you're new to the game and don't know any better. Try not to wide peek as often. In Overwatch 2, Mercy isn't the best support, so you'll often play without a pocket and ultimately without Resurrect. This means you won't be able to play as confidently and can't make as many mistakes. Instead, jiggle peek corners while you're dueling other snipers like Widowmaker or Sojourn in attempt to bait a charge shot before re-challenging. Another huge mistake with Ashe is relying too much on scope shots. Although you might do more damage, the rate of fire and movement speed reduction is a huge downfall with how fast Overwatch 2 currently plays. Furthermore, strafing while scoped in doesn't shift your hitbox as much, making you an easier target for other snipers. This also applies to Dynamite. Learning how to land consistent Dynamite shots while unscoped will improve your ability to multitask. Although I plan on talking about B.O.B later in the video, a general bad habit is engaging into the fight with your ultimate too early. Between Sojourn building railgun off B.O.B, Kiriko's headshot multiplier, and every tank soaking up unlimited damage, B.O.B actually loses value. He dies extremely quick and is easily countered by abilities such as Sleep Dart, Shields, Defense Matrix, and more. With Ashe's Coach Gun cooldown being a very long 10 seconds, you can't afford to waste it on needless actions. Because there's only one tank on the field, make sure to save the Coach Gun to boop the enemy tank out of position while they try to initiate a play. A common mistake is anxiously using Coach Gun in the early fight, meaning you won't have it when it matters most. Kiriko really impacted Ashe's overall effectiveness. Because she's meta and there's no signs of nerfs coming anytime soon, her Suzu Orb cleanses all negative effects, including burn from Dynamite. Make sure to bait cooldowns like Zarya Bubbles and Suzu Orb before using it for max value. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Ashe is not as consistent of a pick in every given composition. I truly recommend playing her while your team is running a poke-heavy composition rather than dive or rush. For example, Ashe pairs very well with Zenyatta or Mercy, but doesn't exactly benefit from Lucio's speed boost. Pay close attention to the supports your team is running versus the supports the other team is running, as it'll often decide whether she's a good pick or not. Next up, try not to jump in place as you're shooting or walking. Ashe's headshot hitbox is massive, and while you're jumping, you create an easy vertical line for any enemy DPS to track. More experienced players can use that movement to their advantage by playing obscure angles, but if you're watching this guide, that's probably not the case. It's important to visualize your hitbox and understand the heroes you're playing against. For example, if you're playing against a Tracer, jumping might keep you from being one-clipped at the expense of your aim. Not timing your reloads was already a problem on Ashe, but it's even more detrimental in Overwatch 2. The game is fast, there are double the amount of team fights and duels, so you'll often find yourself juggling between reloading and shooting. However, it's really important you keep at least 3 to 4 bullets readily available. You don't want to find yourself at 0 because the reload animation is longer, obviously, but that behavior also encourages spamming in the late fight. A lot of Overwatch 2 maps are very flat, and the truth is we've gotten so used to hugging our tanks in Overwatch 1 that we immediately gravitate towards our solo tank playing low ground and contesting point. You need to shake that bad habit and focus on holding high ground, rotating to your team when you need to. Apply pressure on the enemy backline from high ground or off angles and force their tank to take that space from you. This final bad habit is probably where most lower ranked players struggle. Don't spam your shots. As we've already covered, Ashe's reload is really slow and you can't afford to whiff out of stress. Take your time landing important shots and track your Dynamite. Focus on your accuracy and review your game reports to learn where you can improve. This also applies to forcing abilities like Genji's Deflect, Tracer's Recall, and Roadhog's Breather. Up next, we'll be covering some general tips you should take note of while playing Ashe. Our first tip is actually going to help you climb. You need to track the enemy support ultimates before dynamiting. Support ults are better than B.O.B, period. They can defensively counter your win conditions or initiate game-changing fights. Understanding that you might be benefiting their ult economy if you aren't cleaning up those kills is crucial as you play against better support players. Spamming dynamites could actually be a disadvantage to your supports as well, since they'll be constantly playing to mirror the other team rather than playmaking for themselves. Learning how to finish kills and transition between targets through scoped and unscoped shots will absolutely improve your gameplay. There are certain combinations from close to mid-range that guarantee kills on squishies. For example, landing a scoped headshot and then hip firing kills faster than 2 scope shots. These combinations come with practice and muscle memory based on maps and fall-off distance. You're better off killing a Widowmaker across the map with a pool noodle than unscoped shots. Yes, earlier I went off about saving Coach Gun for boosts on tanks pressuring your positioning, but it's equally as important to practice versatile Coach Guns for any given situation. That could be Coach Gun jump shots over obstacles, rotating between high grounds, boops on different heroes and how those pellets impact them, and even finishing off kills. If you didn't know, Coach Gun can actually do a maximum damage of 90, each pellet doing 6 damage, which we'll talk about later in the video. And now that we've talked about bad B.O.B habits, some really great ways of utilizing his presence is for retaking point or stabilizing. Say you lose your tank, you can keep point progress with B.O.B and give them time to respawn, if only for a few seconds. This also applies for regrouping. You can use B.O.B to keep the other team from taking checkpoint while you you execute a full team fight. A common theme in many of the pointers I've already given so far is visualizing Ashe's hitbox. I cannot stress enough how massive her headshot hitbox is, as it includes the entire width of her hat. Understand that even if you can't necessarily see the enemy DPS, your hat actually peeks the corner before you do. Keeping that in mind will help you take safer challenges and limit needless deaths. Aside from her massive head, she also spreads her legs really wide. Her knees will also end up peeking the corner before you do. The truth is, you can't always dictate your whole team's composition, and at any given moment, your tank might swap to a dive hero. Ashe might not be the best dive DPS, but your team can actually help clean up dynamites if you time them correctly. Communicate your cooldowns and pop your dynamite to force support abilities, enabling your dive tank and practically giving them free kills. This can also mean aggressively coach gunning with your dive, taking high ground at the same time. Yet another simple but effective tip is to consistently build B.O.B while B.O.B is already active. Unlike most ultimates in Overwatch 2, Ashe has the ability to build more ult charge during her ult. Follow up on who B.O.B throws in the air, dynamite after they use abilities on B.O.B, and farm damage off their tanks. This will allow you to hopefully have double the ultimates than the other team's supports if done correctly. After each B.O.B, you should have about 25 to 40% ult charge. Dynamite is Ashe's primary ability, and it has an impact damage of 20 to 50 based on proximity, with a burn effect that does 100 HP over 5 seconds. On paper, this sounds very strong, but there are serious drawbacks, including accidentally burning yourself, a janky hitbox, and timing the dynamite itself between kills and fights. You won't always find the opportunity to dynamite, so it's best not to force it. Dynamite should primarily be used for building ult charge or finishing off kills around corners or behind shields because it has a decent radius of 5 meters. The most important tip I could give you is not spamming your dynamite, as it only benefits the other team's ult economy. You'll need to practice strafing while dynamiting, since a very bad habit is remaining still in the open. But start by throwing your dynamite, keeping a static position with your crosshair, and it'll naturally fall into your line of sight. Obviously, you'll learn over time how to throw and detonate dynamites depending on maps and points within those maps. I'd really recommend watching my stream to pick up on good spots. The link is in the description below. Most of the time, you'll want to keep your distance while dynamiting. However, that's not as likely in Overwatch 2. I'd recommend forcing cooldowns like Genji's deflect and Tracer's recall and using your dynamites from close distance. You can also use the dynamite defensively at your feet if you have good supports, forcing flankers to disengage from the fight early. Some players overcommit to dives on Ashe, and it's a phenomenal way of dealing with that pressure. A pro tip I have is using dynamite for the audio cues. When you burn an enemy, they usually scream or grunt, and it helps your team focus certain targets. Make sure to call out your dynamites and coordinate team pushes around them. Practicing your dynamites from multiple ranges is extremely important, as you'll be able to output consistent damage no matter where the enemy sets up. It's easily the best part of her kit at the moment, so take full advantage of that. Dynamites have no fall off, impact multiple enemies, and force the enemy supports to work overtime every fight. Coach Gun is her second ability, typically mapped to your left shift, and will heavily define your movement on Ashe, but that's not all. Coach Gun also does a fair amount of damage. It does 6 damage per pellet and 90 max damage per shot. You can use Coach Gun to push away tanks into optimal range or finish off a smaller target that's pressuring you. Coach Gun is especially good at helping you rotate at a faster speed to take distance. This could be from spawn to get back into the fight or avoiding snipers to cross past a choke. Do this by facing the other direction and quickly turning back after shooting in a seamless movement. By redirecting your Coach Gun, you can jump in different directions to find angles or high ground. Practice Coach Gunning at the peak of your regular jump for max height so you can comfortably land on platforms without clipping your ankles or your head. Timing your Coach Gun depending on the composition the other team is running is essential, since some heroes require that attention. For example, at the moment, Doofus is strong, and you can Coach Gun him during slam to keep him in animation, making for a much easier kill. But let's talk about Overwatch 2. All tanks now have a passive knockback reduction, so don't expect much distance on boops. There are many amazing Coach Gun spots that still hold up today in my older guide, so go give that a watch once you're done here. Lastly, Coach Gun can help you get out of a pinch, especially if it means jumping over a Genji dash during Blade or any zoning ult like Mei's Blizzard, Orissa's Terror Surge, Torbjorn's Juice, and Reinhardt's Earth Shatter. Ashe's movement is great for dodging ultimates and abilities that most heroes cannot. Now, let's talk about B.O.B, Ashe's ultimate and her trusty butler since youth. He's a hunk of a man, but especially useful in Overwatch 2 because he acts like another tanky presence in 5v5. Without necessarily doing anything special, the other team will very likely take a moment to hard focus him or use multiple abilities to limit his potential. B.O.B has 1,000 health, meaning the other team will either need to land consecutive headshots or use Discord to melt him down fast. Your team needs to capitalize on that moment, even if only for a few seconds. They'll be dedicating resources to blocking B.O.B's line of sight, whether that that means booping or shielding him off. Bob lasts for 10 seconds after collision and has a firing range of 40 meters. His priority depends on what's closest, and this is exceptionally important for deciding when and where to place him. Since Bob also focuses on non-playable targets like Baptiste Immortality Field, shields, and Junkrat's Trap, it's important to bait cooldowns ahead of time. All of that time he spends switching between targets chips away at his duration. Bob has a max charge distance of 70 meters, but if he connects with an enemy, he does 120 damage on impact and flings them into the air. This is the most opportune moment to kill any 200 HP target with a scoped headshot. However, be aware that just because he flings an enemy in the air does not mean he'll shoot them. If there is by chance another target that's closer to him, that'll be his priority. It's a common mistake assuming that he'll follow up on his own actions. Another huge mistake that even the best Ashe players make is not placing Bob in a safe distance from being booped off the map or accidentally throwing him off the map. You'll notice Bob's collision hitbox can be hard to read sometimes and he'll slide off certain walls or objects. A big tip is looking for corners or wedges to secure his position. Remember that although Bob is a big boy, he doesn't have the same knockback passive that tanks have. A strategy you can absolutely utilize is giving your team the time and space to regroup or stabilize while Bob is contesting the objective. This applies to every mode and is probably his best feature. Those few seconds change the entire tide of the game and will help your tank follow that space created by Bob. Naturally, this is only a fraction of the game sense I've accumulated over the years of playing Ashe since her launch, and I hope it helped nonetheless. If not, I truly recommend watching my Ashe gameplay either through other videos or tuning into the stream. At the time of making this video, Ashe is becoming a much better hero in the meta, and I can't wait to see you all improve. If you found this video helpful, please be sure to leave a like, comment what tip you found useful, and subscribe for more DPS guides in the future.